All right, well, we're going to be talking about the joys and the realities of parenthood. And I love this, kind of this statement right here. If church starting is like having a baby. If you wait until you can afford it, then you'll never do it. And I think there's a lot of truth to that reality, that if we wait to have a sponsored church, if we wait to say, as a church, we're going to go ahead and launch out into the deep and start one. You know, if you wait until you can afford it, it'll never happen. And sometimes God uses things extemporaneously. My wife and I married in 1982, and we agreed we wouldn't have children. Huh? That's good. 82 is a good year. Yeah. And we agreed we weren't going to have children for 5 years. And so 9 months later, when Joshua was born, everybody was surprised. What was fun, I think one of my favorite memories as a newlywed couple was about 3 months into it, we found that she was expecting, and we started calling family. And, you know, it'd be like calling your parents and, Mom, Dad, great news. Julie's expecting. When? We're going to have a baby in March. You can hear the calculator going off. You know, it's like you can just hear them. Long pause. March? Yeah, middle of March. Great! You know, yeah, so as long as, boy, I can imagine what would happen if we would have said February. Yeah, but it was just such a joy. And here's the thing I want to point out. You know, C.S. Lewis wrote a book called Surprised by Joy, of his salvific experience and how he came to Christ. One of the great truths of that book is that sometimes the unexpected is the greatest joy in our life. And many churches miss out on that joy because they have not been a part of the parenting process. You know, having a baby does change everything. Psychology magazine, Psychology Today, carried an article on January 5th of this year that talked about the fact that when a couple has a baby, everything changes. And if you've had children, you kind of understand that. I know as a young couple, I think the reason we wanted to wait 5 years to have children, we didn't want change. We wanted to be selfish. We wanted it just to be the two of us. We wanted a lot of things to be unchanged for 5 years. You know what's really neat is I'm still relatively young, and my grandchildren are old enough now where, you know, we're going out hunting and shooting, and I get to take them into the woods. Isn't it, you know, I'm just going, God, your plan was so much better than mine. If it would have been my plan, I would have been a 60-year-old with little young grandchildren who would have been just to keep up with them. As it is, I can be out there and I'm the cool granddad. You know, our churches can learn a lot. Tom, you can be replaced with a coffee maker. Our churches are a little bit like that in the sense that sometimes we've waited so long, we've lost that really the relevancy, and we've lost the flexibility that's necessary. Now, the good news is, even if you waited too long, having children changes everything for the best. Now, there are some eternal equations that really need to be understood when we deal with starting churches. And these 3 eternal equations, I don't know where they originally came from. I learned them from a dear friend and mentor, Phil Langley. Phil was the church planning director in California back in the years I was there. He went then to Colorado as a DOM for about 10 years, and he is just now retired to ministry in Texas. But he said, here are the equations. And he was a math professor prior to being called to ministry. And so he loved thinking in the terms of mathematical equations. And he said, growth equals change. And here's what is interesting. So many of our churches, the reason they're reticent to launch into the deep, the reason that everybody's reluctant to change, and the older I get, I find, yes, there's that reluctance to change in me, is because change means there will be growth, but growth means that there will be change. And we're afraid of the implications of either one of them. You cannot grow and not change. It can't happen. And that's one I just want you to ponder. I'm not going to expand on it. I just want you to know that growth equals change. And if your church members are afraid of change, you cannot grow. if you're afraid of change. And the older I get, I find, we have a new president at our seminary. Change. And, we're all sitting there on faculty going, oh boy, what's this going to be like? Well, actually, it's been wonderful, but it's causing all of us to grow. We're all having to grow. Another one is prayer equals power. And, we all want to have the power to be effective in the kingdom. We all want to see the Holy Spirit flow through us, and prayer is the mechanism, and it is the tool that God has given us in our toolbox to be powerful. And so prayer will be a strategy. And you might say, well, one of my concerns is I don't have a praying church. I'm not really a praying person, and that's going to make it really difficult to sponsor a new church. Well, look at it this way. The sponsoring of the new church will be the tool God uses to accentuate and add flavor to your prayer life and your church's prayer life. Now, it can happen one of two ways. Hopefully, it will happen through intentionality. You say, we're going to be prayerful, we're going to schedule time. That's what's exciting when you're intentional in prayer. Now, if you're not intentional in prayer, it's going to be because the building that they rented, the contract was just canceled, that you had a hurricane on the launch day service, and God will use prayer that way. He'll use circumstances to force you to pray. It's really your choice how you want to do that. I kind of recommend the planned approach to prayer rather than the crisis approach. But the bottom line is, if you sponsor a new work, you'll be praying more. And so prayer equals power, and obedience equals blessing. Many of our churches, if you were to look at their history, you're going, I can look at the 10-year statistics. I can look at what we're going through. I can look at the change in the demographics of our church or the graying of our church, and it just seems like there's been a long season since we've had the blessings of God. Well, may I just simply say that obedience brings blessing. And, well, what did we say that churches that don't start new churches? Oh, yeah, they're disobedient, aren't they? Yeah, so it's hard to have blessing when we are unwilling. So just be aware of it. Sponsoring a church will bring change. It will require prayer. And it will become a blessing not only to your church, but ultimately to the multitudes who are unreached as of now. The 7 phases that we're going to look at in the next 30 minutes or so are conception, prenatal, birth, infancy, childhood, adolescence, and maturity. And as we take a look at these phases, we'll talk really and focus on the role of the sponsoring church. Now, for those of you who spend $20 and buy the book, or already have the book, or who spend $12.95 and get the Kindle edition that is kind of funky at times, this is all in your material. Or, as a value added, the resource kit has actually this chapter from the book used with permission in the chapter. So you can look at the charts. I'm not putting up a bunch of really cool looking charts. Why do that when you can use cool looking pictures? So the first phase is conception. During conception phase, the church role, the sponsoring church roles, your role as an existing church leader is to actively either seek from God or adopt the vision from God for the church plant. Now, that brings up a very sometimes sticky point. Where does the vision come from? Sometimes the vision will come from the church planter, and they may approach you. They may approach Dr. Cheney, who then approaches you. Sometimes the vision comes from the church planter. That's okay. If it's from God, we're really okay with that. Sometimes, and I'm finding more and more frequently as churches are becoming aware of the fact that biblically it is our responsibility for churches to reproduce and to start new work. I'm finding more and more that churches are embracing the fact that the vision comes from that local church. It can come from either source. So what you're doing is you're realizing there needs to be a vision for the church plant, and you're either going to be adopting the vision or you are going to be casting the vision for the church plant. Then you're going to be saying, do we have a missions committee? Do we have a team that will serve in that capacity? Do we have a search committee for a planter if the vision arises from your church? In the conception phase, you start to learn as much as possible about the community that you're going to be planting the church in. This is a phase where you begin to say, what is it about this place we're starting a church? It's basically you are doing the community exegesis. Those of you who have been to formal training or you've had a great mentor, you've learned how to exegete the Scripture. You've learned how to take those words and to grapple with them in the original languages and to look at the culture and the context and what did it mean to those original hearers. And we call that process exegesis. And we have many leaders in the church today who are excelling at biblical exegesis and they are failing at community exegesis. And they are culturally disconnected from the context of ministry. My friends, we must become community exegetes and cultural exegetes so that we have balance with the Word and its application. That is why James had to say, we have to have faith and works. You can't have one and the other. You can't have good theology and bad practice. And so you begin this process. And my encouragement would be to begin it with as many people as possible. Several years ago, back in the late 90s, I was implementing my dissertation project for the seminary, and it was on church planting, sponsoring. And as far as I can tell, I believe it was probably one of the first dissertations that really dealt with specifically equipping existing churches to launch new work. And originally I was going to work with just the pastors. And a wise friend of mine, Randy Bennett, gentleman I believe he's referenced in the book because of his impact on our lives. Randy said, Rod, if you want to impact the pastors, make sure you bring a couple of lay people. Because what's going to happen, those lay people are going to hold them accountable. And it was a home run. His wisdom made all the difference in the world. And so when you're doing this community and cultural exegesis, it's one thing for you to know this, but it's another thing for your members to understand it. Because that way they're going to see the need for this church plant. And they're going to see that your church realistically can't reach that people group. That your church realistically is not able to expand its reach currently to that community. And that the only way to fulfill the Great Commission is through planting this new church. So you start doing this cultural and community exegesis. This is where you begin to discuss the church planter covenant. In spin-off churches, one of the great tools in the book is at the last pages, there are about 40 pages of appendices. The appendices include templates of sponsoring church agreements, everything from the standard almost fill-in-the-blank form to processes that are very contextualized based on that unique relationship. And so there's tools there. You begin to work on what are the covenants between yourself and the church planting team. You start to identify and remove the reproductive barriers. What would keep our church from being successful in this process? And you identify them. Might it be attitudinal? Could it be just calendar? For example, maybe your church is one, but we have always had the Annie Armstrong Easter emphasis on the Sunday of Easter. But that's the Sunday that the new church is going to launch their work. So what happens is that all of the seniors who don't want change, they're going to be where? They're going to be for the Annie Armstrong emphasis Sunday. And, well, where are the other people going to be? They're going to be out there helping the new work. So you might have to look and say, are there barriers in our calendar, our budget, even in our communication processes? Are there barriers that would hinder this sponsoring agreement? By the way, that's why time is important, because you have to really examine every system in your church for barriers to the process. You might identify during this period potential members from your church who would be called out to be a part of the church plant. My home church, Lenexa Baptist Church, recently launched a new work in Greenville, Missouri, about 30 miles away. My Sunday school class moved for 6 months. I teach an adult Sunday school class called Seeking the Truth. And for 6 months, we moved our class and we held it at the new church. The class quadrupled during that time. And when we left, There were only 12 of us that came back to Lenexa Baptist Church. The rest of them stayed with the new work. What a creative idea. And several Sunday schools did it. It wasn't just mine. It was several that we did that. But we tried to identify really good people who could go out and be sent out. And again, it goes back to what we said earlier. You send your very best. Send your most talented musicians. Send your most talented leaders. One of the reasons that's important is because sometimes we have so much talent in our church. You have men and women who you are going to say, I can't do without them. They are the best treasurer. He is the most skilled deacon or elder. Man, I don't know what I'd do without them. You keep them because they're so good. And that means that potential elder, that potential treasurer, that future deacon never gets that opportunity to serve because there's no place for them. Are you aware of that reality? And your church has become the Dead Sea in that area. Wow. Can I just say I've been guilty of that as a pastor? Of having people, and I've just learned, I've programmed myself, when I think of someone, I'm going, man, that person's invaluable. It's like, Lord, would that be a good sign that they need to be sent out? And sometimes God says, no, I just wanted to make sure you are willing. I just want to make sure they're willing. And now that I know that you're willing to, I'm going to provide you a sacrificial lamb so you don't have to murder your son. Do you see the scriptural principle here? So, during conception, you're dealing with these logistics. You start to develop the prayer network. You initiate contact with the association, with the state convention, possibly with Send America and other networks. You will begin the prayer process. My focus at this conception phase is to get the church to pray for the soil. Pray for the soil that the seed of the gospel will be planted in. I was talking over the break with a brother who was a fellow farmer growing up. And folks, praying for the soil, man, you need to pray for it because you know what? You need to be praying that soil is healthy, it's good. Tell you what, there's a lot of soil out there that's hard packed, and what happens? You can't put a seed in it. Nothing will grow. You need to pray for the soil. And you know what I found? Soil needs to be watered. Otherwise, it becomes hard packed. And you know the best watering for soil is with the tears of our prayer for the lostness of the people. We begin that process. You begin to look at the support package and what you can commit financially. You pray that God will send all of the partners that are needed for this new work. And in this phase, it's critical not to be overbearing, pushing too fast. Because if you do that, this is the phase where very quickly the dream can become aborted. Do not abort what God has conceived. From the conception phase, we move to the prenatal phase. At this point, the sponsoring church's role is to begin working with the planter in finding a strategic location for the plant. You begin your budget preparation, and now you're securing the resources that you started to identify where they might be. You start meeting regularly with the planter. You get them involved in networking with other planters so that they can, as iron sharpens iron, sharpen one another. This is the best phase for you to start networking with pastors whose churches are sponsoring work successfully so that you can glean from them. You know, it's interesting, if you were to say, Rod, what were some of the most successful things in your ministry? They would be the ones that are hardly worthy of print. One of my most successful dreams is networking, what we used to call multiplying church networks. Translation, in Starbucks and Barnes & Noble's bookstores across California and Missouri, we have groups of pastors who meet every week and have been doing this so for now over 15 years, talking about church planning and church planning issues. No book's been written about them except one, and that was called The Great Coffee Houses of California. They actually printed up what we did. They said, this is weird. We go to all these coffee shops and we find these groups of men talking about church planting. And then when they finally wrote it up in this book on the Great Coffee Houses of California, they actually put in a little subnote about, so weird. We've gone to several coffee shops and there's these groups of men talking about starting churches. It was actually the existing church planters that were there. Pastors. They were talking about, what do we do? How do we do it? Get in the network of others who are like-minded. Begin working with your association, and if you need to, maybe get training so that you can become an effective mentor or supervisor. This is at the point where you begin now to deploy and commission the members of your church who might go with that new church plant if it is one in your local area. By the way, sending members does not mean just local. Sunday, my home church sent out 2 couples. One is going overseas, and one is going to Atlanta to be church planters of churches that we're sponsoring. But that's the kind of commitment that you get people to make when they see God in something. And so usually we think of the sending of members to sending churches that might be geographically close, but it could even be if you're a partner of a church somewhere else. If they sense God is leading them, send them out. This is a good time that you can host a baby shower for the new work. This gets a lot of people who are kind of on the fringes involved, and basically you're doing like a baby shower, but you're getting things that they might need: microphones, sound system cables, welcome cards, business cards. You put together a baby shower, and just let people who are good at coordinating that stuff take over, and you as a pastor primarily just show up.
You're saying make that a formal event, make that a
Oh, yeah.
event, not just walking in, asking do you have any sound equipment.
Oh, yeah. We make it a big event. We do a baby shower, and we actually usually will get some of the ladies who really are into baby showers. Now, see, to me, a baby shower would be Dante's 7th level of hell. Wow. That is not who I am. But when it's for missions, we move out of our comfort zone. Here's what's funny. I've never been in a church where I didn't have at least one lady who thought that a baby shower is as close to heaven on earth as we can get. And so they will coordinate it. They'll help plan it. They get it. And here's what's exciting about hosting this baby shower for a church plant is that often is the event that causes some of the fringe ladies and people who really just don't understand what this church sponsoring is about. Suddenly they now get it. Because I think there's a part in us where we just want to nurture that which is new. We want to nurture that. And they just understand that, wow, yeah, I guess, you know what? Our church began as a baby. And a lot of children are born into the world with very little support. That's a crisis globally. And so anything we can do to help them on the front end, they suddenly get it. It's like the light bulb will come off. So come on at this point. So this is the prenatal period. This is where we continue to maybe provide administration and logistical services. We can help them plan their preview services. And we can now actually start deploying. This is when we need to start sending the finances, because they're going to need it as they get ready to prepare for the actual birth of the church. We can do prayer vigils for them. We can provide some follow-up with core team members. We host the dedication service during this period. Again, this is all in your worksheets, but I want you to hear a lot goes on during this prenatal period. So often we as men, all we know is the only thing that's happening during the prenatal period is someone is getting fatter. That is not good. We need to understand all that God is doing as the eyes, the ears, the nose, the lungs, the limbs, everything's being formed. That's what we're doing for this church plant during this period. Because what is birth is pretty much what it's going to look at. That DNA is going to continue with that church for many, many years. And so this is that period of the prenatal season. We move into the next phase, which is actually the birth of the church. In the birth of the church, I read in 1 Peter, like newborn babes, long for the pure milk of the word, so that you might grow in respect to salvation, if you have tasted of the kindness of the Lord. Wow. At this phase in the church's life, the church is really going to be just on milk. This is when we need to be with them. We are a part of that first service. We want to be engaged in the launch service. maybe by sending a contingency from our church to be with them. We want to celebrate with them. We want to help send out birth announcements and let everybody in our church know what's happened. This is a celebration time. It's interesting. The birth phase is a very short phase. It focuses on celebration, prayer, and rejoicing in what God has done. That is your primary goal. Now, for the church planter, the birth phase is everything he's lived for, and so we need to understand it. For the sponsoring church, this is the easy part. It's like being a grandparent or a husband. We don't really have a lot to do with that. We just kind of show up and enjoy it. For the ladies, on the other hand, they probably have a different perspective of the birth. It's a lot of work. And so the church planter, remember, he's really tired. As a sponsor in the birth phase, one thing you might want to do is just say, hey, by the way, we'll watch your kids so you can take a couple days off. Or think about some of the things you could do like you would for a young couple who's just had their first child. You might be able to help give them some time off, take a little bit of the weight. Here's what I would think. On budgeting, we've not talked about 48-week budgets or 49-week budgets and all this. Wouldn't it be neat to be able to say, by the way, for the next week after the birth of your church, we're going to undergird your budget 100% this week? Home run! Yeah, because think about it. They've just gone through the birth. Birth isn't a big thing for the sponsoring church. It's a big thing for the planning team. So remember, we're talking about the sponsoring church here. Some good ideas for you. Now we move into infancy. We read in Scripture, I had to feed you with milk, not with solid food, because you were not ready for anything stronger. And you still aren't ready. I chose this Scripture because as soon as the church is birthed, many church planners think that they're ready to be on their own. Paul had to remind the church that no, they were not ready yet. They were not there yet. During infancy, you want to continue to provide a reinforcing model of church health. You might need to remember that seemingly small hurdles for the church plant, in their perspective, seem like huge barriers, okay? What seems to be a little crisis on our behalf, like their third-week budget didn't meet their expectations, they might be thinking that's a crisis, and we might be saying, no, that's typical because it's the fifth Sunday, and fifth Sunday giving is always down. We know that they don't. So there's a lot of areas where you can just give that encouragement to help them realize when one of their scaffolding members calls up and says, hey, by the way, Pastor, we're going to First United Methodist next week. You can say, hey, that's not a crisis. They've been with you through the prenatal period. They've been with you through the birth. They've been with you now for a few months. That is normal. They're going off to help another church with a new project. Don't panic. This is where you can use your maturity to help reassure and calm them. How many parents, when their child cries all night, call the doctor and take them to the emergency room? Lots of them. Why? Because they're panicking. How many of us know that's normal? Yeah, isn't that how it works? See what your role is here? This is a good time for you to have regular contact with the church planter because they're going to have a lot of questions and they're going to be reticent to ask them maybe. They don't want to ask, they don't want you to think that, well, hold it, I'm a church planter. I have a seminary degree and I don't have all the answers. They're going to be very reticent to admit that. And they'll really appreciate it if you can just kind of be there so they can just nonchalantly ask the question. The question is asked, did I realize that as the professor? Yes, that was a great, the commenting, if it wasn't picked up on tape, is the importance of, once again, having a team that's able to anticipate some of these questions and work with the church planners based on our experiences, what we didn't have. And the question was asked, where did this come from when I incorporated it maybe into the material. A lot of it came from my experience as a church planner and what I didn't have. But a lot of it came from the fact that I early on realized I needed to network with pastors. And so I started to watch other church plants in northern Minnesota fail. And I said, I don't want to be like one of those. And as a result, I sought out pastors to say, well, how did this church get started and survive? And so part of it is just realizing, I think what you're saying is this becomes a universal truth. It's the same in Florida as it is in Minnesota, as it is in Missouri, and as it would be over the seas. Excellent point that you're bringing up here, though, that we need to be there to provide that continued support. This is also a time where you have obviously continued support of the church through prayer. But this young phase of infancy, again, recognizing the church planter, it's like a young parent. They've got so many questions and they need somewhere to go to. During childhood, this is the time where you start to revisit the goals and objectives of the new work. This is the time to start saying, okay, how are we doing? Are we developmentally where you should be? I have a grandchild who is not developmentally where she should be. And she got to this point where she moved from infancy to childhood, and we started noticing, we need to do some assessment so that we can intervene appropriately in her development and in her life. And, in the same way, we might need to say, okay, what mistakes have been made, and how can we encourage grace when those mistakes have been made, but also how can we learn lessons from them? Now's a good time to look at the milestones that have been achieved and share those with your congregations, because this is when in your congregation some of the people are saying, why are we still supporting them? They're running X number of people. It might be 30, it could be 300, and you're saying, why are we supporting them at this point? This is where you begin to ask questions rather than give answers. Big transition. Now's when you start asking the church planter the questions so that church planter has to start coming up with what? The answers. This is not when you tell them 1 + 1 is 2. Now's when you start saying, hey, what is 17 times 8? And you let them provide the answer. You ask questions and let them grapple with it. How are you going to handle the ending of your associational funding? How are you going to handle the move to the next facility? How are you going to handle the loss of Walmart closing down their distribution center and the loss of 18 jobs that are in your congregation? How are you going to prepare for, let's say, a disaster? Start asking them questions, either real or hypothetical, but you move from telling them and giving them answers to asking questions. This is a great time in the life of a church. It's kind of like in parenting. You start changing from telling them. The reason we have so many immature children today who are in their 20s is because they've only been told by their parents. Their parents never made the transition from telling them to asking them. And that's a common problem in parenting. By the way, I'm doing much better job as a grandparent than I did as a parent. Amen. Can any of you, do I get an amen? Amen? Can you imagine? Tell that to your church. Your first sponsoring experience may not have been stellar. Folks, you'll do a better job as a grandparent. You really will. I'll tell you, being a grandparent, I'm a much better grandparent than I was a parent. Now, I am blessed that my kids turned out halfway decent. Tom, can I have an amen? Amen. I am blessed. But now I'm going to add the caveat is this: by the grace of God. Okay? So these are some of the things we do in this period. Then we move into the adolescence period. For everyone who partakes of milk is not accustomed to the word of righteousness, for he is an infant. At a point, you have to move from infancy and you've got to start eating the meat. And this should be an exciting period of discovery. This is where you give them increased autonomy. You start making them make the decisions. You are saying, you know what? Wow, you need to look at both ends of that, or both, what are the pros and cons? But you give them increased autonomy. You now begin to decrease your support. You know, isn't there a point where you say, no, you're not getting an allowance, you need to get a what? A job. Yeah. You start decreasing the support. You start encouraging new ideas. You don't avoid contact. Now, here's the biggest challenge. In adolescence, the sponsoring church tends to avoid contact. You know, we don't really know how to, we don't like adolescence. That's a difficult year. Wouldn't you just love them to go away? But it doesn't work that way. This is when they need contact. They need that parent to be there. But now you're not asking questions, because if you ask questions, they think you're doing what? You're prodding. You're not telling them what to do. You now are doing the ministry of presence. The ministry of presence during adolescence. And so this is, again, a change. And the ministry of presence is especially important because they're going to think you're a horrible parent. You don't love me. You cut my support. You don't love me. You're not paying for our building rental. You don't love me. You're not sending us more members anymore. Be present. Don't say much. Just be there. Don't avoid them, because that will really hurt in the long run. Discuss reproductive values. This is when you need to have the birds and the bees talk with them about sponsoring a new work on their own. What are their plans for mission? Because I don't know of a church plant who hasn't said when they get started, we are going to be a church planting church. How many of you have heard that? We have reproductive DNA in our, until they get to adolescence, and now it's all about me. Adolescents are really self-centered. And we need to keep the conversation about reproduction and talk about the good parts of reproduction, because all teenagers, they need to know this. They need to know this in this phase. Highlight the accomplishments of the new work publicly and encourage prayer and counsel for the weaknesses. This is where you also begin to focus the prayer on their future. You help them plan their complete autonomy. You work with the leadership if you've not done a constituting service in that already, which may have been done, but now's the time that you really plan that empty nest. We finally move on to maturity, and in maturity is where you help them plan and participate in really autonomy and church planting. Now's when you begin planning your next sponsoring endeavor. Now's when you take that time that Tom mentioned, which is, maybe several months or 6 months away from where you're not sponsoring a work, so that the people in your church are starting to say, hey, when are we going to do this? When are we going to do this next? In maturity, we find Hebrews 5:14, but solid food is for the mature, for those who have their powers of discernment trained by constant practice to distinguish good from evil. This is an exciting period of time. It is a time that leads us into, I think, the next slide, because Tom just wrote on the board that I've got to move forward. So now, once they've moved to maturity, you're doing your next church plant. We do need to go into money. This is actually a pretty easy lesson here. Because once the decision is made to sponsor a church, somebody's going to ask you, isn't it? Is somebody going to ask, Tom, go ahead and put 20 up there, okay? Okay, yeah, you can put 20 up there. Keep me honest. Okay. How much is it going to cost? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I'll tell you what. Effective leaders don't mind that question. In fact, they are anticipating it. They are looking forward to it, because now, think about this. That question is your opportunity to say, this is what the church is all about and why we exist and what our mission is. This is the question you should be living for. When my perspective changed from, I knew you were going to ask that question, to, I am so glad you asked that question, because that's at the heart of it. Because if we don't do it, it's going to cost us everything. It's going to cost our future. So let's start talking about what will it cost. Now, sponsoring does not always mean money. That's kind of like the myth breaker number one. Churches many times assume it's going to take a lot of money. The reality is any church, no matter what their size, age, social economic level, can be involved in church planting. It doesn't cost anything to become a praying church. And let me assure you, the kingdom needs churches who would say, we are going to become partnering churches and we are going to seriously be praying for the new work. It doesn't cost anything. Encouragement does not cost anything. We actually had a pastor in Lindsay, California. Their church was small, but one of his ministries was he went to all of the church plants in our association when I was the DOM, and he just gave them encouragement every single week. Everybody loved this pastor. He was in a small church. He was retired. He used his time to encourage the church planters, and he became one of our heroes. Didn't cost any money. Legitimacy. Your name as a partnering church will help legitimize a new work. Many times people will say, well, hold it. Now, we've got this new work over here. It doesn't have Baptist in the name. We're uncomfortable with it. And it might be that your church's good name helps legitimize that church in the community. That's sometimes a very valuable resource. Space. Your church, I've been to churches that they're a little bit like a pinball machine. Not much is going on in most of the real estate. All the action's in one little place. Man, we've got a lot of buildings that their sponsorship could be, we're going to let you use our space. We're going to let you use some of our resources. And that's especially relevant when we're talking about churches that might be of a different social economic or a different ethnicity than yours. You may be in an African American church that has a lot of space, and yet now there's a Hispanic community there, and they could use that space. So material resources. Many times your church has material resources that are underused. Not that I'd pick on anybody, but I know of churches that have 3 buses that don't get any exercise. And it could be that the church plant could use them. You might have tables and chairs and desks that aren't being used. We had one church plant, they needed office supplies. And we knew of a church that had vacant offices. They had gone from being a large church of 800-900, kind of one of those First Baptist churches that had been 800-900 for decades, and now they're down to about 150. And they literally had offices that were vacant, and so they were able to provide the office materials. Let me give an example here. First Baptist Church of Shafter, California. I was the intentional transitional pastor for that church. It was the first Southern Baptist church in the state. Nobody wanted to see it die. They were actually going to close, and they had agreed to give the building to another denomination when they found out that the church actually owed money to the convention from a loan. And so the convention intervened and assigned me as the person to go there. This church had no interest in missions. But through time of prayer, finally, this small group of people, I went to the WMU. The church didn't want to sponsor a church, but the WMU still met. Have you ever been in a church like that? There's no people. We're talking under 15 in worship, and yet they still had a WMU ministry. And it was 4 ladies who would get together, all in their 80s. And I went to them and said, would you be willing to pray for the Filipino peoples who have never heard the gospel? And they agreed to pray for the Filipino people. About a month later, I went back. We have a new Filipino church starting in Delano, California. Would you pray for that new work and for the church planter? And I showed them pictures of the church planter and his wife and their little baby, and they prayed. And then they said, when's the church planter coming on the field? I said, he'll be here in March. Do they need anything? They have nothing. Where are they moving? Into an apartment? Does the apartment have furniture? No. Does it have a crib? No. Do they have food? No. That 4-member WMU adopted them. They had some of the men in the church, or actually neighbors. No, they weren't even members of the church. They had some men drive them over to Delano, because none of them drove anymore, and they decorated the apartment. They brought quilts and blankets. Then they realized that the apartment had an empty refrigerator, empty cupboards, and so they did a pounding. That means that they each went out and enlisted pounds of food, and they started doing that. And when that church planting couple arrived from the Philippines to plant this church, they walked into an apartment that was filled with love and food. Folks, if you'll be strategic, you can get churches to start doing missions, okay? So you can do this with no monetary support. The initial support of a church is critical. It's a critical factor in their incubation stage. And the early period must include time preparing the money. Here's a story worth retelling. In Orange County Baptist Association in California back in 1979, the Associational Missions Committee chairman, who was a pastor of a church, he was pastor of First Baptist Church Norwalk, noted that there had been no successful church plants in 10 years of unprecedented growth. In the last 10 years, the association hadn't successfully planted one new church, and yet Orange County, which is where Disneyland is, Orange County during the 70s had doubled in size. And so Charles Engelman, the Associational Missions Committee chairman, wanted to know why. He interviewed those who had attempted to plant churches, and guess what the number one reason was? They didn't have enough money. So they had tried to start an Anglo church, didn't have enough money. Tried to start Spanish churches, tried to start African American churches. And there had been about a half dozen church plants in that 10-year period, and everyone failed. And so he decided to come up with an idea that would also become his doctoral project to get 5 sponsoring churches that would provide the church planter salary, insurance, housing, operations, and ministry. And it became an actual program that the Home Mission Board adopted called the 515 later on. 5 churches partnering to plant a church with a 5-year commitment. Well, the partners wrote 1,500 hand-addressed letters. They invited people to the first service on Easter 1980, and they helped Rick Warren go door to door, and the church that was planted using the 515 strategy was Saddleback. Folks, let me tell you something. There's a story behind the story in almost every success that will never get in print. Saddleback is a response and the result of a doctorate of ministry project by Charles Engelman entitled Laying the Foundations for an Exurban Church Plant in Orange County, California. The key is the number one reason church plants failed is they didn't have money. Now, what you read about Rick Warren, is it true? Yeah. Did he graduate from Southwestern Seminary? Yes. Did he have a Chevy Nova? Yes. Did he rent a U-Haul trailer? Yes. Did he get an invitation from the director of missions to come? Yes, because the director of missions, what they did is they said, what kind of church planter do they need? What Rick doesn't tell in his book is that he was indigenous to this association. He was indigenous to the culture and the people. He was a very good preacher, and he had already proven himself as an effective evangelist. But what I want you to hear is when he arrived, did he have to worry about salary? Did he have to worry about housing, insurance? Did he have to worry about, do we have people to go help us volunteer? And of course, Saddleback has become one of the success stories in Baptist life. To whom much has been given, much is required, and yet the median annual giving in American Christian churches is just about $200. About 0.5% of after-tax income. About 5% of American Christians provide 60% of all the monies that churches receive. Great article in Christianity Today. The article was called Scrooge Lives Today. And it was really pointing out especially Baptist churches. We are horrible about this, that we let a very small number of our people do most of our financial giving. So you have not because you ask not. People say that the reason they don't give is, well, they don't get asked. One of the things that you're going to have to do as a sponsoring church pastor is ask people. Not just people in your church, but maybe even people that you know, businessmen. Tell them about this new work. Have some material. Give them a business card saying, hey, by the way, we're starting a new work. Would you pray about it? Man, they've got a lot of needs. Would you pray for this church as they get started? And see what God does. It's interesting that nearly all denominations teach that Christians should give 10% or more, but the teaching is rarely reinforced. Pastors that were surveyed were reluctant to bring up the issue because they closely tie it to their salary. That means that you need to have advocates in your church who will bring up the needs other than yourself. You need to have it brought up from the pulpit. And if you can't do it, get them to do it. The study also found that pastors themselves often do not tithe. And if that's the case, that just simply exasperates the problem of ever coming up with the resources. So we have to look at ourselves. By the way, one of the things I have done is if I'm going to be doing a church plant, I ask this question: will I be willing to double my tithe for a period? Or would I be able to give an extra percent? If I'm already giving 10, would I give 11 and let that extra percent? You will lead by example. In fact, can we just say that together in unison? I'm going to ask you to say, we will lead by example. Let's say that together. We will lead by example. And if you are asking your people to take a step of faith and even to be willing to say, give until it hurts because God will bless because of the principle of the sower, and you're not willing to do that yourself because you've got some lame excuse that exempts you because you have a clergy card, heaven forbid. Folks, we can almost stop this right there. That is so critical. But we're not. We're going to continue on a little bit. Okay? Tom, I got your hopes up, didn't I? What Charles Engelman found in Orange County of California was reinforced by J.D. Payne's research. J.D. was the Nehemiah professor at Southern Seminary, and he did some research back in the early 2000s, and he found that the number one concern of church planners was finance. That caused them to worry more than anything else. It was the number one concern of church planters, and it was the number one concern of their spouses. Folks, if you're worrying about money all the time, it's going to be really hard to be successful and win some in the community. Richard Smith is a doctoral student. He's graduated. He's now the director of missions in the Boot Hill Baptist Association in Missouri. But Richard, his research was on failed church plants 2000 to 2005 in the state of Missouri. And it's sad when you realize that there were so many failed church plants, you could do a very comprehensive research project just on that one topic. And what he found that the primary reason cited by the church planners for failure was finances. The primary reason cited by the sponsors was inept leadership. I'm just hoping that their finger is pointed like this. 1, 2, 3, 4, and not 1. Because you know what happens? Sometimes we have to take responsibility. Because when we heard that the number one reason for the church plant's failure on the perspective of the sponsoring church was leadership, we also found that every pastor who said leadership, that their church had reneged on their financial agreements early on. There's kind of a balance. There's everything needs to be in balance. And could some of it be leadership? Yeah, they probably got the wrong church planter. This conference that's part of what, Tom, you've already dealt with some of that today. We got to get the right people. But we also got to make sure that we have the right finances. We need to make sure that that's there. And if your heart is burdened for a community and you say, we need to sponsor this work, and there's no way your church can do it on its own, that's why you're being trained and equipped to partner. And at lunch, I want you to go out over lunch and grapple with this and talk about it and say, what can we do so that the next time churches are planted, we don't have another horror story and another failure that the world looks at and says, you planned a building and it failed, and they make a mockery of us. And families are torn apart. By the way, did you know that the number of divorces among failed church planners is very high? Only for Missouri. Only for Missouri, and it was 50%. 50. Which, by the way, that's the national average. But we're talking 50% in a 5-year period. That is not the national average. I only have Missouri data. I don't think anybody's done a comprehensive. What we know, though, is Missouri doesn't feel or taste any different than the rest of the nation. It was really, really high. And by the way, almost all of those planters had gone through church planter assessment. Anybody here work for the state convention? Good. This won't be true of Florida, but this was true. They had all gone through the church planter assessment. Over half of them had failed and been deployed anyways. Ever, right? Never happened in Florida. Good. Because then what happens? They send them to Missouri so they can be out there. It works out pretty good. But, it was really scary what we found. Yeah, it was scary. I was a coordinator for the Midwestern Seminary Church Planting Assessment Center, and 50% of our candidates didn't make it, and 100% got deployed. It was horrible. It broke our hearts. But, those are just things we need to be looking at. But here, let me just say, how do you do this? Well, you've got to plan what it's going to cost. This was Tom's statement, actually, but Tom, I agree with it because it's so true, and that is, it'll cost more than you think. It'll cost more than you think. The cost is going to obviously depend on the size of the vision, the type of the launch, the people you're trying to reach. Now, a lesson that I want to point out to is that the pastor and the planter, you need to plan that their income is going to be about 80 to 100% of the median household income for that community. Household income includes spouse income, bivocational income. You must adjust for inflation. So if you're using 2000 census statistics, that's 12 years out of date. And then note this, living close to the field is important. A planter who lives on the other side of the tracks to save money will be cheaper to support and ineffective in his work. Too often, we do stupid things. We send a planter out and say, well, yeah, but you can live in this apartment. It's only a half mile from the field, but that half mile might be over the proverbial tracks. It may not be something that you can reach. The planter should not set his salary alone. Planters tend not to, I found they tend to set it too low. They don't seem to understand that insurance and what real costs are. They don't think that cars ever break down. They don't understand how much it really costs to do hospitality. And we need to work with them in those areas. They need to understand budgeting and things. So there's a lot that we can do to help coach and mentor them. But let me just simply say, don't let them set their salary, because usually they're going to set themselves up for pain and failure. The biblical pattern suggests that support should come from the sending church in Acts 13, a vocation, bivocationalism, Paul's example, Acts 18, the church being planted, 1 Timothy 5:18. That means this new church plant, from the time they start together as a core group, every member of that core group ought to be tithing to their work. Do you see that? And sometimes I don't see that in the budget. I've seen church planting budgets that don't show any money from it shows money from all over the world. Send churches, First Atlanta, all kinds of things. Hey, do these folks know about In Christ Church, Hollywood, California? Okay. Money is obviously the solution, right? So if you had like a couple $1 million, y'all can get a church started, right? No. One of the greatest debacles in probably modern history was a church called In Christ, a partnership of First Baptist Atlanta, the North American Mission Board, and the California Southern Baptist Convention. A church with a church planting budget of over $2 million that died in 7 months, launching with over 700 in the first service and totally dead 7 months later, having spent almost all the resources. It was the super church to set the template for planting mega churches. Money is not the solution. But without it, we got problems. So just, remember that balance. And if you want to read about In Christ Church, there's some stuff on the internet about it, but there's also a lot of people that were involved in that church plant. I think kind of pride and ego might have got into the situation. And the irony, the pride and ego was not the church planter. It was the sponsoring church. Church planter, by the way, went on to start a church plant in Fresno, California, and is doing great. Doing a very, very good job. And then there's other churches that support the work. So this is the biblical pattern. Look at your funding sources and ask, are the funding sources aligned with the biblical planter? And so this is what you're going to do as you go in groups. Out to lunch. I want you to spend some of your time coming up with ways your church could provide financial support for church planting. Stay focused on sharing ideas of how your church can raise support. Plant a church, but focus on your church. Don't be thinking, well, the church down the road could do this. No, you need to be thinking, what could your church do? And just talk as a group. Estimate, what you come up with, and see if what we've been talking about really will work. Because, my friends, money's out there. And it's in your churches. Tom, thank you.